Happy 2024, everyone. Welcome to the Calimesa Insider podcast. I'm Will Kolbow, the city manager for the city of Calimesa. We'll see how this goes. It's been a while since I've done this, and I do want to apologize for that. Our last episode was a little over 3 months ago. It took place at our State of the City. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I recommend that you check it out. We interviewed a couple of our city council members. We interviewed the president and executive assistant for the Calimesa Chamber of Commerce. So it was a great show. All good things are intended well, right? And I intended to obviously record this podcast, monthly, and that was the intention. And but obviously that has not happened. So again, it's been a little over 3 months, and just you get into the holiday season, and and it's not like I dedicate a big part of my life to this job and to this community, as my family would attest to. But there are obviously personal commitments that you have during the holidays, and things have been very, very busy here at City Hall. They always are, but there's been some unique challenges that have popped up over the last few months that we've had to deal with, and so I wanted to make sure that I focus my attention on those things. And not to make any excuses or anything, but this podcast is recorded on top of other things. As a matter of fact, I'm here at City Hall by myself. It's Friday, January 12th, and we're closed. So we're open Monday through Thursday from 7 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. So I decided to come in on Friday to get this episode recorded. One of the reasons that I wanted to do it sooner rather than later is because I wanted to record it prior to our next city council meeting, which will take place on Tuesday, January 16th. It's moved from our normal Monday schedule because of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. But I think it's also important because with 2024, with ringing in the new year, we are now in a presidential election year. And so political talk really starts to ramp up. And first and foremost, I just want to remind people this is not a political podcast, okay? As city manager, one of my primary duties is to remain apolitical, provide objective advice to the city council, and carry out what their wishes and visions are. And, that can change. So with our election coming up, we do have 3 seats up for grabs in the 2024 election here in the city of Calimesa. And there could be changes as a result of that. Every election brings the opportunity for change. And if that does happen, the priorities of the council may shift. And as a result, staff will have to shift in order to continue to meet the objectives of the council. We work for the council that's in place, not for the council that hired us, especially in my case, because I actually do work directly for the council. So, my objective is to carry out the vision and priorities of the city council and direction of the city council that is in place. So when these election years come up, especially during a presidential election year, there's so much focus on, oh my gosh, who's going to be the next president of the United States? And yes, it's important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to dismiss it and say it's not important. But how many people actually get to make an impact on public policy at the federal level? To a certain extent, they do with the legislature, especially the House of Representatives. It's easier to get a hold of somebody in the office of, let's say, Ken Calvert, right? Ken Calvert is the representative that serves Calimesa. And so each, congressional district, I don't know what the exact number is right now, but I think it might be in the 700,000 population range, approximately. Don't quote me on that. But even then, that's only one vote of 435 people, right? So they obviously still have an uphill battle. They can carry legislation. They can listen to their constituents to see what they want and try to push for those changes or push for those objectives. But it's really difficult when they're only one of 435 people. In Calimesa, you have 5 city council members that serve just this community. And so those things are really important. But the other thing that is unique to local government is the ability for the public to participate in the process. Your voice means more at the local level than it does anywhere else. Because in Calimesa, you look at our population, we're just under 11,000 people. Your voice is one of 11,000 versus one of 330 million if you look at it from a nationwide standpoint. So they're easier. You can get, when you write to Congressman Calvert, there's a chance you may get to talk to him directly, but likely you're going to be talking to his staff. Whereas in local government, you can talk directly with your elected officials. If you attend a city council meeting, sometimes people come up afterwards and engage in conversation with council members, and they're more than willing to do that. But I've noticed there's been some newcomers, I would say. I call them newcomers, that in the sense of they're new to city council meetings. So they've never attended before, so they may not understand how the process works. And I understand that. Government and civics is taught in school, but they primarily focus on the federal level because they want to standardize it. So whether it's taught here in California or Texas or Illinois or Iowa or any other state out there, the federal government works the same way, right? It's all one federal government. They serve all of us. And so that curriculum is very easy to scale and to teach. But local government, each local government is unique in how it runs. There are certain parameters and certain frameworks, and we're going to talk about that in this episode as to how the public process works. But it's so disparate, especially when you go to other states. So other states have other laws, other regulations on how they conduct public meetings, how they do the public's business, what the staff's in charge of versus what has to go to city councils, things like that. And the structures are different too. Like for example, in Michigan and Illinois, you have townships, you have towns, you have cities, you have these different levels of government that don't exist here. In California, you have cities and special districts, which are probably the lowest level of local government. Then you have the county, then you have the state. So it's pretty straightforward. So cities, special districts, school districts, those are your local level types of government. Then you go to the county level, and then you go to the state level. So in this episode, I want to really talk about that process and how it applies here. Obviously, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the city of Calimesa. Some of these principles might be applicable to other cities, and they may have similar formats. The way they lay out their agenda might be different. The order of events might be different. Where they put certain things in the agenda, things like that. But they all have to follow, for example, what's called the Brown Act. So, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I think part of the challenge we have right now in local government, probably more so than any other time, or at least in a long time, because public, strife at the federal level and strife at, for presidential politics is nothing new. It's existed for basically the entire existence of our country. But when you combine not knowing and understanding a process with the erosion of trust in government trust is at a low point right now. It definitely has fallen over the last, 10, 20 years. And I wouldn't say it's at an all-time low point, because I can't speculate on what things were like 100, 150 years ago. Especially, you think about it, this country has literally gone through a civil war. We had a part of the country break off from the country. So you can't say that trust was probably pretty low at that point, right? I don't know if it's lower than that it is today. But it's primarily due to what's happening at the federal level. Now, that's not to say that people at the local level are perfect. We can just look next door to us and see what happened in the city of Beaumont. And I don't want to air their dirty laundry. They're doing very well. We have a great partnership with them. But there's no doubt that there were public officials that did some really bad things in that city within the last 10 years. And so, all those people are gone and they've been prosecuted, but it has happened, and that does contribute to the erosion of trust. So when you combine those two things, the lack of understanding with that erosion of trust, you jump to conclusions and you fill in gaps of your lack of knowledge with your assumptions. And if you assume that people are corrupt or in it for themselves or doing something sinister, that's how you're going to then paint the process in your own mind. With all other things being equal, if you don't understand a process, you're going to fill in that process in your own mind as to how it works, and you're going to jump to assumptions to how it works. So I think that now, don't get me wrong here. My goal is not in this episode to change the minds of people that already have a low perception of government officials and government in general. Okay, I don't think I'm going to change those people. All I can do is explain how things work, talk to you about how you can participate, how your voice can be heard, how to do that effectively by understanding the process, and then you can then go from there. And you can see if it plays out the way that I see it. The other thing is that we are human beings. The city council are human beings. I'm a human being. Our city staff are human beings. Human beings, just think about yourself. When you go to your job, you do it for a paycheck, but I think people want to do the best that they can. Most people want to do the best that they can in whatever they do, right? And that's no different here. Does that mean we're going to be perfect? No, we're not going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. Processes may be, fumbled a little bit. And that's just the way it is, but it's just human. It's human flaws. It has nothing to do with being corrupt. It's just about, we're imperfect beings, and that's just the way it is. So, but I think if I at least explain how the process is supposed to work and what the guidelines that we have, maybe that helps the conversation. So there are two items that guide how our council meetings work. So you think about the most basic way, the most basic time that you have direct engagement with your government, and that's during council meetings or meetings of the planning commission, things like that, when they have decisions in front of them, because there are some decisions that are only made at the planning commission level with certain things to do with planning and zoning, and everything else comes up to the city council. So there's the Brown Act, and that's a state law, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a second. And there's the city council policies and procedures. The latest version of that was adopted back in April 2023. That's resolution number 2023-18. So if you look up that meeting, you'll find that item on the agenda, and you'll see the latest version of all of our rules, our policies and procedures on how the council meetings run. Now, obviously, that's under the auspices of the Brown Act. The Brown Act would trump. Like, we can't put something in our own policies and procedures that would be in violation of the Brown Act. The Brown Act is the overarching law that governs public meetings. So I have a handbook, actually, that's prepared and updated regularly by our city's law firm, which is Richards, Watson, and Gershon. So when you see Quinn Barrow at our city council meetings, he works for the firm of Richards, Watson, and Gershon, or RWG. So if you hear us refer to RWG, that's who we're talking about. And so it's the full name of it is the Ralph M. Brown Act. So when you think about Brown Act, it's not Jerry Brown, it's not Pat Brown, the two former governors. It's named after the assembly member that authored the act back in 1953. Now, it's been amended many times since then to adjust for, emerging trends or technology and things like that. Like, the Brown Act does refer specifically to things being posted on the website. Well, obviously, websites didn't exist in 1953, right? So obviously, this is a law that is regularly updated to reflect, and also because there's some ambiguities in it, as court cases come along, there are amendments to address things that were found to maybe not be clear, and so that the legislature tries to clear those things up. So this is California's version of what is known as a sunshine law for local government. You hear that term sunshine law. The Brown Act is what that is for the state of California. And the Brown Act only applies to local government agencies. So when you think about cities, counties, special districts, school districts, regional boards, like the Riverside County Transportation Commission, which the city of Calimesa is a member of, the Brown Act applies to them. It does not apply to the state government. There are other laws that govern how the state government conducts their business. But in a nutshell, the Brown Act requires local government business to be conducted at open and public meetings, except in certain limited situations. So if there's like a grand opening and the city council's all there, it doesn't have to be publicly noticed, right? Because they're not going to be discussing business. But when they're there, they are barred from having conversations about city business, okay? Because it's not a posted meeting, and so they're not in session to discuss business. They can have small talk. It's not like they can't talk at all while they're at those events, but they cannot have a conversation congregating together to discuss city business, but they're allowed to gather together, okay? So the act applies to legislative bodies such as the city council, as well as commissions, committees, boards, or other bodies of the local agency, whether they have decision-making or advisory roles. So in some cases, Planning Commission acts as a decision-making body for certain types of items. And, you have the Parks, Trails, and Community Services Commission, you have the Library Commission, you have the Mobile Home Rent Stabilization Board. Those are all advisory boards, but they are also subject to the Brown Act. And I could probably do a whole episode on just the requirements of the Brown Act, but instead I'm going to focus on the structure and the flow of a city council meeting. And then there's going to be parts where I'm going to talk about how the Brown Act applies to certain things, such as closed session. So I've heard of somebody, making a comment, well, and then you guys go back and talk about what you're ever going to talk about. Well, the agenda says exactly what we're going to talk about, and there are very finite things that you can discuss in open session or in closed session, because you cannot talk about anything else. The Brown Act actually specifically says, except for the items that we say you can talk about in closed session, no other thing can be talked about in closed session. So it's very, very specific and very, very clear as to what can be discussed in closed session. So, and the agenda has to disclose what part of the Brown Act that the closed session item covers. And we're going to talk about some of those things later on. So I've heard some and seen comments on Facebook and heard whisperings about how some conversations and debate on the dais between the city council members seems kind of disjointed sometimes, but so that sometimes they, I can't, this is so unprofessional, why, they look like a bunch of idiots because they're, they should have talked about this before. Well, the Brown Act prevents you from doing just that. And honestly, you don't want that to happen, because that means they're having substantive discussions that are the public's business outside of your purview. And you don't want that. The first time the city council has an opportunity to discuss and debate an issue or an item is with one another, is during that public meeting. So sometimes the conversation may get disorganized because of that, because they're all bringing their own points of view and they're bringing up things that maybe weren't thought of before. So yeah, sometimes it is going to be a little bit disjointed, because that's the point though, right? You want to see that conversation from the beginning. You don't want to have them talk about it somewhere else outside of the public view, have everything kind of figured out what they're going to say, and then come out and say it in open session, right? That is the antithesis of sunshine laws. And that is the antithesis of the Brown Act. And the Brown Act, the whole purpose of it was to prevent that kind of thing from happening. Now, that's not to say that I don't have conversations one-on-one individually with council members. But I cannot, and I will not, convey, information from one council member and then go talk to another council member and say, okay, so I talk to council member A, and then I go to council member B and tell them what council member A said. I don't do that. I have one-on-one conversations, giving them information or answering questions they may have about certain things, but I don't share that with the next council member that I talk to. So I talk to them one-on-one individually and they're all my bosses, and I want to make sure that I understand what their priorities are so that when we craft the agenda and we bring items forward, it's because I know these are priorities for the city council. Now, when they actually get into open session to discuss it, that's the first time they're talking about it as a group. And then that's when they deliberate it, and that's when they make the decisions. And you get to see that process. You get to see that happen during the city council meetings. That's the open session. That's the public aspect of it. So the Brown Act, so every meeting has an agenda. The Brown Act requires that. And the Brown Act requires that the agenda be posted in a public place at least 72 hours before a regular meeting. If the agenda is not posted at least 72 hours in advance, a meeting is considered a special meeting, and there are limits on what the city council can discuss and vote on in a special meeting. And so the Brown Act actually does talk about the limitations that you have for a special meeting. The agenda contains a brief description, and this is, again, right from our Brown Act handbook. The agenda contains a brief description of each item of business to be transacted or discussed at the meeting. The agenda should make clear whether items may be acted on or whether they are information only. So if the agenda says that the council will only discuss an item, they cannot take action on that item. So usually when you look at our agenda, you'll see a title to describe what the item is and what staff's recommended action is. And so between those two things, that will give you an idea of what the nature of the item is and what outcome or what direction that the staff is looking for. When we make a recommendation, that does not mean that the council has to take that recommendation, but at least it gives you a guide it gives you a nature of what is going to be decided upon. So that's what the agenda is supposed to outline, okay? We also post the agenda and full agenda packet, which includes staff reports and related attachments on the city's website concurrent with the legal posting of the agenda. So when we post the agenda, we post it outside of the senior center so people can see that the physical copy of it. We have copies of it here at City Hall if people would like to pick one up. But we also make it available on our website. And this is a critical piece of participating in a meeting. It's your opportunity to read about an item, read about the staff report. Now, going into the meeting, you pretty much have the same information that the city council has and that what they're going to use to make a decision on that item, okay? That is really important, and that information is powerful, and that can that can help you craft comments you have, or it may spark you to want to attend a meeting because you want to talk about the specific item, and you've read through the staff report, you get an idea of what it's about, and then you can go and participate. Now, there's other ways to participate besides just showing up, and I will talk about that at the end. But you can find all of our agenda packets on our website at cityofcalimesa.net, and then there's a button on the homepage that says Agendas and Minutes. And then you can find the agenda for the city council as well as all of our commissions right there on the website. So it's really critical that obviously if you're listening to this podcast, you probably do have access to the internet. And so you're able to go out and read about every single item on our agenda. There's a staff report for every item that describes what we are doing. So let's look at the anatomy of a meeting. The agenda is your guide, right? So that kind of tells you what's going to happen. So the first thing is the mayor calls the meeting to order. And that cannot be done anytime before the posted time of the agenda. It can be done after, But you don't, for example, you don't want the agenda posting, the agenda to say the meeting's at 6 p.m. and then the mayor calls the meeting to order at 5:30, because your expectation as a member of the public is that meeting's going to start at 6 p.m., not at 5:30. So if the meeting started at 5:30 and you expected it to start at 6 and you show up at 6 and the meeting's already been going on in a half hour, that's not very transparent, right? So the mayor cannot, so that's sometimes you'll see us just kind of sitting around, maybe a couple of minutes before the meeting, just waiting, because we cannot legally start that meeting until 6 p.m., okay? In the case of regular meetings. Whatever time is posted on the agenda is when we cannot start the meeting any earlier than that. Then we go into roll call. That's required to put to put on the record all those members of the city council that are present and those that are absent. So the minutes want to reflect who's here. So you do a roll call. They say here. It seems like a kind of an antiquated thing, but it is still a requirement and it is good public practice. Then we do the Pledge of Allegiance. We used to follow that up by special presentations. At our last city council meeting, we had some employee recognition. Sometimes we'll have some state agencies usually want to sometimes come in and do a little presentation on something that they're doing. We've had the Department of Insurance come through, the Department of the Insurance Commissioner or the Office of the Insurance Commissioner. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it had something to do with insurance at the state level. They come in and give a presentation. We've had Edison do that before. I think in a future meeting, we actually might do a separate workshop for this for RCTC, but stay tuned for that. So those are the kind of things. It's very informed. It's not. There's no decisions being made. It's just for education. There's no decisions that are made during that part of the meeting, and part of that's an important concept because we'll talk about that, why that's important a little bit later. The next item is communications from the public, and sometimes you'll hear that called public comment. And I'm going to read verbatim from our agenda what it says this item is. Speakers may comment for up to 3 minutes on any matter within the subject matter jurisdiction of the City Council, including agenda items. For scheduling purposes, the Council encourages speakers to submit a speaker card. After receiving public comments, council members or staff, after being recognized by the mayor, who chairs the meeting, may briefly respond to statements made by the public or questions posed by the public. In addition, council members may ask for clarification or make a referral to staff for factual information to be reported back to the City Council at a later meeting. Speakers who wish to comment on public hearing agenda items, which we'll talk about later, are encouraged to comment when those items are heard, so their comments may be included in the record of the hearing. So a public hearing is a little more formalized type of thing that's required for certain things. So we'll talk about that later. So what does that mean? First, if you wish to speak, there are speaker cards you can fill out. They're near the entrance of the council chamber, which is basically the big room inside the senior center. You'll fill out your name, and at least your name. You don't have to fill out the rest, but it's helpful if you fill out your address and phone number, so we know if you're Calimesa resident, and we also know if we have a phone number, we can follow up with you. So if you have specific questions or comments that probably warrant a follow-up, we'll have your contact information so staff can get a hold of you. And you indicate what item you want to speak on, or you leave the item number blank if you want to just speak during communications from the public. All right. So typically during communications from the public, those are typically about non-agenda items. So things that are not on the agenda. So if you make comments on things that are not on the agenda, the city council cannot have a discussion about that. They can, like we laid out, they can ask questions for clarification to kind of clear the record, which actually did happen at our last council meeting, by the way. But the city council cannot debate things. They cannot debate anything that's not on the agenda. And the reason for that is that you don't want decisions or debates happening on items that people weren't aware of that were going to be discussed. So the agenda lays out what's going to be discussed so that members of the public, if they are interested in attending, can do so. So you don't want, if there's something that's really important to you, like maybe let's say, I don't know, the public wants a park somewhere. This is just an example, not doesn't apply to here necessarily. Well, it's not on the agenda, but it's something that's really important to you. And all of a sudden you hear afterwards that the city council decided to put a park, to talk about a park somewhere. Like, well, wait a minute. I would have liked to participated in that. So if it's not on the agenda, they cannot discuss it. They cannot debate it. There can only be limited questions, discussion specific to what the person's bringing up, but no substantive argument. As a matter of fact, if you hear the city council starting to kind of go into that realm where it's looking like they're maybe debating and kind of going back and forth on an item, you'll hear either myself or the city attorney step in and say, council, this isn't on the agenda. I don't think this discussion should continue, because now we're kind of getting into a debate a little bit. So it's our job a little bit is between the city attorney and myself to kind of be the gatekeepers of that, right? So, but items that are on the consent calendar, communications from the public, that's also when you would provide those comments, because typically we do not do public comment for items that are on the consent calendar. And we'll talk about what the consent calendar is in a minute. And for business items, in that spiel, it said you can talk about items on the agenda. But just remember, if you talk about those items during communications from the public, you will not have an opportunity to speak about those things again when that item comes up. So I think that my encouragement would be, if you have a public comment on a specific item on the agenda, indicate that agenda number item on your card, and then you'll get called up at that point. Okay? Because you would speak after staff gets the presentation. Because for business items, staff usually does give at least a brief report, if not a very detailed report. So that would be then your opportunity to comment on that, because you want to comment after you have enough information, or at least the same information that the council has had, to make your voice known before they make their decision. Okay. So let me see. I want to make sure that I'm following I put a whole script together because I don't want to miss anything. I want to make it very important. And you could even maybe not intend to give a public comment initially, but then show up to the meeting, hear an item, and go, actually, I have something to say about that. So you can go and fill out a card and give it to the clerk, but for the flow of the meeting and to make very, very, very sure that you have your opportunity to speak, it's best to try to do it, if at all possible, before the meeting. When you get there, before the meeting starts, you hand your card to the city clerk, because then she takes the cards that she's collected up to the start of the meeting and hands them to the mayor. So then we'd have to, she has to get up, she has to go give the mayor, the cards, the new cards that come in. That's not to say you can't do that, because maybe, you honestly just didn't have an intention to speak and you changed your mind while you're hearing the presentation being given. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Now the Brown Act and I talked about that already, how it restricts to the council and what they can debate. We've had some members of the public asked to move communications from the public from the beginning to the end of the meeting. And to me, for the public process to be very effective and for you to have influence over decisions that the council makes, it would be counterproductive to do it at the end, because you can give your commentary that night about how you feel about these things, but you're giving your commentary after the decisions have already been made. So you really didn't have any influence on the decision. You're just basically giving comment on what you think of that, but it's not going to be influential. And, who knows? The council could go, I wish you'd have said that. They could be thinking in their mind, I wish this person would have said that before I made that decision, because I may have changed my mind. So that's why it's important to read not just the agenda, but the agenda packet before the meeting, so that and are educated on those items, and then you can come and speak before the decisions are made. That's why I think having public comment at the beginning, given the fact that we provide all this information for you to educate yourself on what the item is about, it's more beneficial to be at the beginning. So then after public communications from the public, there's the approval of the agenda and consent calendar and waiver of the full reading of ordinances. So basically what it says, at this time, the city council can notify the public of any changes to the agenda, remove items from the consent calendar for individual consideration, or rearrange the order of the agenda. So what is the consent calendar? So this is what it says. Items on the consent calendar are considered routine and customary items that are enacted by a single motion, with the exception of items previously, that are removed from the consent calendar for individual consideration. Any items removed will be heard immediately after the taking action on the consent calendar. The minutes. So some examples of this. The minutes from previous meetings for approval, contract approvals, check register, certain reports that are required to be disclosed, things like that. Like I said, very routine things. However, all of those things are still accompanied by a staff report. So you can still, even though there's no verbal staff report given at the meeting and there's no debate about those items, you can still find out what they are about by reading the agenda packet. And again, that's why getting that agenda packet before the meeting and reading through the items is very, very important to your successful participation and your active participation in the meeting. The waiver of full readings of ordinances, just so that for ordinances, if you don't do this, you're required to read the full text of it. These things can be 100 pages long. So you could just have somebody just droning on and on and on and reading. So the Brown Act allows you to waive the full reading of it and you just read it by title only. So when we approve ordinances, we just approve them by reading the title of that. And part of that is because we already include the full text of the ordinance in the agenda packet. And so there is a way for the public to read the full text of that ordinance prior to its adoption. Then after that, we have reports from the Calimesa Chamber of Commerce. Not all cities do that. Not all cities have a designated part on their agenda for the Chamber of Commerce. We have that on a monthly basis. Our sheriff's captain reports on a monthly basis. Our fire chief reports on a monthly basis. They usually report stats from the prior month and other things that are going on. Again, this is because public's in part of the reason that that's on the agenda, as you don't have the finance director report, planning director report, because public safety is a very high priority in almost all, definitely here, in almost all jurisdictions. That's usually ranked number 1 or number 2 in terms of importance and priority for the public. So they actually have their own parts of the agenda where they communicate things that are going on in their departments. And then we come to business items. This is where items are discussed individually, presented, discussed, and voted upon. And we've had some, bigger ones that have drawn a crowd the last few months. Obviously, back on October 2nd of 2023, we had the residential overlay zone that drew many, many people. It was the biggest meeting I've been involved with since coming to the city of Calimesa. I've been involved in bigger ones in other cities, but it was certainly the biggest, the most well-attended one here. And and that makes sense, right? Because it was a very important item that affected a lot of people. And land use decisions are, some of the most important decisions that a city council makes, because it has a very, direct impact on people. And so it does draw people. But, when we bring items on the agenda to the council, sometimes it's because, we're trying to, we have projects that we have in our capital projects, and there's certain steps we're going to take. So in this next agenda, for example, we have pavement rehab on the agenda to talk about, so that the council can decide and direct staff of what streets they want to pave as part of our pavement management program. And so we provide the data, we provide the information for the council to make their decision, and then they make their decision, and then we go and do the work. But there's some things that we have to bring forward, not because we want to. I mean, certainly if it were up to us, knowing this community, knowing this council, I would not have put the overlay zone on the agenda for their consideration if it's something we didn't have to do, right? Staff, there's a mandate from the state to do something. Staff has to come up with solutions and ways to get that done. while trying to maintain the integrity of what the community wants, what the council wants to the greatest extent possible, right? So we come forward with, we come up with a solution, we bring it forward, we talk about, we describe what that solution is, then you hear public comment, and then the council, based on all of that information, knowing that there's a mandate also, because I can guarantee you, I mean, based on the feedback, based on the conversation that happened at the dais, just based on the stuff that was discussed in open session, I don't think the council would adopt something that they didn't have to adopt, because it's not like the council wants to be in the business of approving things that that the community almost universally dislikes, right? So they're not going to approve it just for the sake of approving it. They're approving it because there's, state mandates that we have to meet. And we are a subdivision of the state, right? So the state has superiority over us. And there have been lawsuits when it comes to RENA numbers and housing and things like that, and cities have not fared well because of that very reason. The state can dictate those things because they have superior, it's just like in the Constitution, right? The federal government is supreme to the state governments, but the Constitution, and the only reason the states have power is because of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is what says what's not even whatever's not in the federal purview, the states can decide upon, right? But if the federal government, but the states cannot go against the federal Constitution, right? So it's the same type of thing in this case. The state has a lot of control over what we do. So when you see items, the business items on the agenda, and sometimes they're things that people don't like, it's not because we're just thinking we know better or we're just going to want to do what we want to do. There's very specific reasons for that, and I would not have brought it forward. I can tell you as city manager, I would have not brought forward an item that was that unpopular just because I thought it was a good idea, right? Because it's not about me. It's not about what I think. Obviously, you want to rely on my professional opinion and my direction and things like that, because I will try to bring things that that ultimately will benefit the community. But if I know something is unpopular and is going to create strife, I'm not going to bring it forward just because I think it's a good idea, right? It's because it's not about me. So just want to put that out there. Then during business items, we have something what's called public hearings. The public hearings, there's some confusion about what that is and what the difference between just a regular business item is and what a public hearing is. When you think about it just from in very basic terms, the meeting itself is a public hearing, right? Because items can be heard, they can be debated, they can be the public can have input, and things are ultimately decided. But public hearings, there's a very specific definition about how they're done. Some of it has to do with noticing. There are certain items that are required to be done in what is called a public hearing, and that public hearing takes place within a meeting, okay? Most commonly, and not in all cases, there are other cases as well, but most commonly, those are for planning and zoning items. Almost all planning and zoning items require a public hearing. And certain types of public hearings have noticing requirements. So we have to put them, in addition to posting our agenda in accordance with the Brown Act, we also have to post a notice of this specific item farther in advance. Sometimes 10 days, sometimes more, depending on what the nature of the item is. We have to publish it in the paper. We have to post it on our message board outside. So there's certain things that we have to do for noticing before the hearing even takes place. So that is one of the distinct differences between like a regular business item and something that requires a public hearing. Then there's a specific structure, and it's a more structured type of item. And so here's how it's laid out in our City Council Policies and Procedures resolution. The mayor opens the public hearing. The city clerk then certifies the public hearing has been duly noticed, as we talked about with this, and informs the public whether further correspondence has been received after the posting of the agenda. Now, I will talk about what that could be communications from the public, communications from staff, communications from an applicant if it's a development project, let's say, or some kind of development project. Then staff will give their presentation. Then the applicant or representative gives a presentation if it's applicable to this type of hearing. If this public hearing is as a result of an appeal, let's say it's an appeal of a planning commission decision. Okay, so the planning commission makes a decision on some type of thing that they are the final decision-making authority. And whoever, somebody comes forward and wants to appeal that decision, they can appeal it to the city council. Well, whoever made that appeal would then have an opportunity to give a presentation. Sometimes the applicant and the appellant are the same thing, because if let's say the planning commission rejected something, then maybe the applicant is the one appealing the planning commission's decision. Let's say the planning commission approves something that a member of the public wanted to appeal. So then the applicant would have an opportunity to make their presentation, and then the member of the public that made the appeal would have an opportunity to make a presentation. And that's separate from public comment, because the next part is then public comment. So when you filled that card out for that particular item, that's the time that you come up and speak on that item. So it's after you've seen the staff presentation, it's after you've seen the applicant's presentation, and if there's if it's an appeal case, it's after you've heard from the appellant as well. So then the public gets an opportunity to make their voice heard, the ones that are not either the applicant or the appellant. Then if it's requested, and this is an application for development, obviously they can, the applicant can hear, and the applicant for a development project is granted due process, because they're making, it's more of in a public hearing where the council is making a decision on, let's say, land use or development, they're acting more as, a quasi-judicial body rather than or especially in the case of an appeal, they're acting as a quasi-judicial body. So if you think about it from a court standpoint, the applicant is akin to the defendant. So the defendant has a right to due process. So the applicant has a right to due process. And this has been a matter of strife for some members of the public that I've heard, because they say, well, it's unfair that the applicant gets so much more time than members of the public. But in a cumulative standpoint, that might not be the case, because the applicant only can give their presentation once, and then they can then come up and rebut, because the next portion after public comment is rebuttal. So because they are the ones that are granted due process, and this is set up by state and federal rules, that they are the ones that are granted due process in this thing, because the city council is deciding their fate, the fate of their land that they own, not necessarily of someone else's land. Now, yes, can that land use affect your land? Absolutely. That's why this is done in this way. But at the end of the day, the fate of that person's land is in the council's hands, which is why they are granted a little more time to make that argument. However, the public, in a cumulative sense, because you may have 50, 100 people come and sign up to speak on that item, then the members of the public could have up to, if every single person of 100 people takes up their 3 minutes, that's 300 minutes. That's 5 hours. So the public got 5 hours to discuss an item. So yes, the applicant then has the opportunity to do a rebuttal if they request to do so, to maybe correct some misperceptions that were put out there, or maybe correct the record on some of the things that the public comments were made on. And in the case of public comments that are made on a business item or in a public hearing, because we're considering that item in particular, the council can respond to, maybe not during public comment, but during their debate, they could respond to certain public comments. They can respond directly to those, right? They can't respond directly to the public comment and get into a debate with the public during public comment. The public comment time is the time for the public to make their voice known. It's not the time to have a two-way debate. It is a one-way conversation, the public to the council. The council takes that into the collective. They may refer back to that later on when they're debating it, but they're not going to have a active debate with any members of the public. They may ask questions of the applicant so that they understand or have clarification on what they're doing. But, and so they'll ask questions of staff, maybe during the staff presentation, they'll ask questions of the applicant during the applicant's presentation, and even during their applicant's rebuttal. So after all of that, then the mayor closes the public hearing. At that point, then the debate is just with the city council. Okay. They still may ask questions of staff, but it's not until that time will the council start to reveal what their feelings are and what they think should happen with this decision. That they will not, and they should not engage in debate until that portion of the meeting. And so that's why a public hearing is a much more formal type of item, and it's very much more structured because of the ramifications. And usually the reason that it's a public hearing is because of the ramifications of the decisions. It's a much more important decision than out of the normal. Not that all the decisions that the council make aren't important, but there are some that are obviously more important than others. And usually public hearings will entail those more important decisions, which is what calls for a more formal process. And then after that discussion and deliberation, then they'll have their motion and they'll vote. So that's how a public hearing works. It's a very formalized process. It's just basically a formal business item that has a very distinct structure to it. And usually when we have really big items, we'll actually provide the mayor a script to make sure that all items are done in the right order, in the right way, not to say that is not for influencing the decision. It's just to make sure that the flow is done correctly, because sometimes decisions can be challenged if proper procedures are not followed. Now, there's some leeway to that, but it is really important that, especially with big controversial items, that things are done the right way. And you don't leave yourself up for challenge, because then that can be costly to taxpayers, right? Because if someone appeals or someone fights that or sues the city because things weren't done right, then we have to engage attorneys, and there's a bunch of costs that are associated with that. Sometimes those things can be indemnified by developers, but I'm kind of getting into the weeds there. But bottom line is, we want to make sure we do especially those things in the right way. So remember, I said, going back to public comments during a public hearing, one of the things that I said during communications from the public was, speakers who wish to comment on public hearing agenda items are encouraged to comment when those items are heard, so their comments may be included in the record of the hearing. Because when you look at the minutes, if you want to be on the record as being in favor or against something, it's not going to be clear from the record if you make that determination during communication from the public. It will be clear if it's included with the item that is discussed during a public hearing. And so that's how you get your name on the record, okay? And that's why it's important that you fill out your card ahead of the public hearing to ensure you get your time to speak during that item and that your voice is heard. And just like communications from the public comments during public hearings are limited to 3 minutes. Now, that could be limited further. The Brown Act requires at least 2 minutes. I don't even know about that. It doesn't specify time necessarily. The standard time, the customary time, is 3 minutes. But if there are a lot of speakers and we need to consolidate things in it, that time can be shortened. The chair of the meeting has the right to do that. But I think that, to the extent possible, we try to make sure that we leave that at 3 minutes. Because we don't want, I don't think people want to hang out here until 2:00 in the morning waiting for a decision to be made, because there's tons and tons of public comment. Not that we don't want the voice of the public to be heard, but sometimes it's after a while, especially on a controversial item, there's the theme tends to start repeating itself with public comments. And so sometimes it's just a matter of, I want to say that I'm against this project and I agree with so-and-so. So, you can count so-and-so's comments as my comments too, and you're done, right? So we encourage that too, that if a point's already been made, you can just say, I agree with what so-and-so said, and I'm against this project, and you're done. You don't have to reiterate what they said because the council heard it the first time, right? The whole point is to let the council know what your opinion is. Well, if your opinion is the same as someone else, just say mine's the same as so-and-so, and I'm against the project. And then that's that. And the council knows that. And if the council hears 20, 30, 40, 100 people say, I agree with Joe Smith, what he said about that, then, you're probably in good shape. So then we get to mayor and council member reporting on county and regional meetings and conferences. This is what it says in the agenda. This is the time for general comments, announcements, reports on meetings attended at public expenses required by AB 1234, which is the ethics, which is basically known as the ethics rule. Requests of staff and other issues of concern to council members may be presented briefly at this time. The council may not legally take action on any item presented at this time other than direct staff to investigate a complaint or place an item on a future agenda unless one, by a majority vote, the council determines that an emergency situation exists as defined by Government Code Section 54956.5, which is part of the Brown Act, or two, by a fourth-fifths vote, the council determines that there is a need for immediate action and the need for action arose subsequent to the agenda being posted as required by Government Code Section 954.2b, which is also part of the Brown Act. So in addition to the city council meetings, council members sit on various regional boards that the city is a member of. So I'll give you a few examples. The Riverside County Transportation Commission, or RCTC, the Western Riverside Council of Governments, or WRCOG, Western Riverside County Regional Conservation Authority, also known as RCA, and the Riverside Transit Agency, RTA, just to name a few. Council members report on their meetings to the public, so the public is aware of what's happening on the regional level. And I think that I've heard comments from members of the public that have, wanted to comment on things that are happening at RCTC. They're just the messenger. They're just bringing that information back on decisions that have been made at the regional level. If you have issues with what that agency is doing, they also have public meetings that you can attend and make public comment on and read the agendas of and agenda packets and everything like that. And so, I hear people say, well, I can't believe we're spending much money on this. Okay. Tell RCTC, tell RCA that, because that's, as the member of the agency or as a member of that board of the agency, I'm sure our representative wants to hear that feedback. But I think if you want to make sure that your voice is heard before those things are considered, you would do the same thing and attend those regional board meetings, so that you can have your public comment to all of the board members that are on there from all over Riverside County. Okay. So a lot of these items go well beyond Calimesa. So I think some members of the public seem to be confusing it that these things are happening only in Calimesa. They're not. It's actually stuff regionally. So there are things that the council participates on and they're required to report back on that are of regional significance. Then there's a city manager report where sometimes I give it updates, sometimes I don't. Then you have the Brown Act. The Brown Act is strict. You have closed session. The Brown Act is strict on what can be discussed in private. So here are the types of items that can be discussed in closed session that are applicable to our city. Applications from persons with criminal record. I've never seen that one before personally. Response to final draft audit report. I've never seen that one also because I've been fortunate to be in cities that have had clean audits and haven't had those kind of issues. Real property negotiations. So it would not be in the public's interest for the city to openly negotiate and have a discussion on real property, because obviously we're using taxpayer money to purchase the property. So you don't want the other side that we're buying it from or selling to know what our negotiation position is and our strategy, because it puts us at a disadvantage. We don't know what their strategy is going to be, but if they can watch a meeting and know what ours is, they're going to be able to jack up the price. Like if we go and say, look, we're going to try to buy it for X, but I may have to go to Y, right? I don't want the other side to know that I have authority to go to Y, because that's exactly where they're going to go. They know they're not going to have to accept less than that. So it kills my negotiating position as the city's negotiator. So those are the kind of things you want to be discussed in closed session. Now, on the agenda, it discloses what we're discussing, and it discusses the property that we are discussing. So the public still knows what we're doing, what the nature of the conversation is. They just don't know the specifics, because it would not be in the public's interest for that stuff to be discussed in public. Hopefully that makes sense. Same thing with pending litigation, liability claims, employee matters. It's the same type of thing. Now, when you talk about employee matters, that can be, in my case, it can be city manager appointment, valuation, discipline, termination, salary discussions, things like that. It can also be labor negotiations. And again, you don't want the city council talking about their labor negotiating strategy out in the open, because again, that hurts their position and it could cost taxpayer money, because now again, I want to be in a position to negotiate a better deal than, you get some authorization, but you still try to negotiate the best deal. It's not like I go, okay, I have authorization to this, and I go to the bargaining table and go, okay, council's giving you this, right? Because that's not good use of taxpayer money. I want to try to negotiate the best deal I can on behalf of the taxpayers. And if the other side knows what I'm going to negotiate, then then I can't do that. You take my ability away to do that. And it actually will cost, in the long run, the public more money. So, but once a deal is struck with a labor group, let's say, and we don't have unions here, by the way, at the city of Calimesa, just so you know, there's no represented employees at this point. But if, in cities that do have that, the final contract is put on an open agenda and is approved in a public meeting. So you will see the final result of that, and you'll see the financial ramifications of that based on an agenda item that is presented for public consumption. Okay. It's just the negotiating, right? So you don't get to see how the sausage is made, but you get to see the final product, right, before it's approved by the city council. So it's not like it's all done in closed session. It's the end product is brought forward for approval in open session before it goes into effect. Okay. So that's a distinction there. So one thing I want to talk about, and I know this has been a very long episode, so I apologize that this has been long, but I think these are things that are very, very important. And I hope that I don't lose people because it's such a long episode. It is important, and as I mentioned at the beginning, is important that you remember we're humans, but it's also to remember important that maintaining decorum in city council meetings so as to not disrupt meetings is important, because it's the people's business that we're working on, right? And we actually have in our city council policies and procedures, section 5 talks about decorum. It talks about decorum for council members, for city staff, and for members of the public. And while the First Amendment is important, and that's why it's the First Amendment, it's also important to keep in mind that decorum rules are in place to ensure that public business gets done, because then you're exercising your First Amendment right could infringe on other people's right for the people's business to move forward. So there's a very delicate balance as to how that all plays out. So luckily, our rules and the Brown Act kind of give us some guidance on what that is. So here's what our rules of decorum say for members of the public. Members of the public attending any council meeting shall avoid any conduct that actually disrupts, disturbs, impedes, or renders infeasible the orderly conduct of the meeting, as set forth in Government Code Section 54957.9, which is, again, part of the Brown Act, In the event that any meeting is willfully interrupted by a group or groups of persons so as to render the orderly conduct of such meeting unfeasible, and order cannot be restored by the removal of individuals who are willfully interrupting the meeting, the members of the city council may order the meeting room cleared and continue the session. Only matters appearing on the agenda may be considered in such a session. Duly accredited representatives of the press and other news media, except those participating in the disturbance, shall be allowed to attend any session held pursuant to this section. Nothing in this section shall prohibit the city council from establishing a procedure for readmitting an individual or individuals not responsible for willfully disturbing the orderly conduct of the meeting. And so let's talk about the enforcement of decorum. As set forth in Government Code Section 54957.95, the mayor may remove or cause the removal of an individual for disrupting the meeting. Prior to removing an individual, the mayor must warn the individual that their behavior is disrupting the meeting and that their failure to cease their behavior may result in their removal. So you get a warning. The mayor may then remove the individual if they do not promptly cease their disruptive behavior. As used in this paragraph, disrupting means engaging in behavior during a meeting of the city council that actually disrupts, disturbs, impedes, or renders infeasible the orderly conduct of the meeting. Now, notwithstanding what I just read, the individual disrupting the meeting is using, if the individual is disrupting, excuse me, let me start again. If the individual disrupting the meeting is using force or a true threat of force, they may be removed without a prior warning to cease their behavior. So example, someone pulls a gun and points it at someone. There's no warning on that. They will be promptly removed, right? And that's probably a very extreme example, but you can't just say, okay, I'm going to give you a warning because, obviously it may be too late by then if someone's willing to do that. So I do want to wrap this up because this has gone very, very long, and I apologize for the long-windedness of this, but I think it's all very important to talk about. Since our council chamber is relatively small, and my seat is close to members of the public, at least behind me, I do hear a lot of whispers and groans. And people have a right to their opinions. And for the most part, it doesn't disrupt it. I mean, it's disappointing sometimes, especially the maybe where it's coming from or what the perception is, and it certainly doesn't rise to the level of interfering with the meeting, right? But I would like to remind everyone again, as I stated at the beginning, we're all human beings. I can't speak for anyone else, but I can tell you, the job I do is difficult. It's one of those things that in taking this position, and this is my first city manager assignment, one of the things that I've had to really learn is that you're not going to, as Abraham Lincoln said, you're not going to please all the people all the time. And so, but I'm just trying to do the best I can for this community. That's my first and foremost objective. Try to do what the council expects of me and try to do right by this community. That is my number one priority objective. And I think without that, I think when city managers stray from that, that's when they're not successful. But no matter who sits on that dais, who now or in the future, that's never going to change. My dedication to trying to do the best I can for the city, and try to do what is right. And so, it is disappointing sometimes when people throw around the terms like, criminal, corrupt, things like that. Because, I get it. I get why that perception comes down. But I certainly don't believe that I've done anything that I've done would indicate that anything like that's happening here at this city. There are things that, don't always go right. We've had projects that haven't gone very well for us. And there's been a lot of some missteps, some unfortunate circumstances. But it's not because we're not trying our best to try to deliver on what the public expects of us. And so, if, one of the things that I had a meeting yesterday in the city of Yucaipa, we do a joint collaboration with the city of Yucaipa, the Yucaipa Calimesa Joint Unified School District, Crafton Hills College, Yucaipa Valley Water District. So all the staffs get together every other month to talk about what's happening in their cities. And one of the initiatives that the school district is doing is focusing on kindness this month. And so, it's okay to disagree. It's okay to even be critical, but let's try to at least be kind to one another. And look at it from, I give the public the benefit of the doubt when they're coming from. I just, sometimes they're frustrated and angry with how things go. And, I want to sympathize with that. Right. And I want to appreciate that frustration, and I want to be able to maybe, work together to get, come up with solutions to those frustrations. And I think sometimes, the perceptions maybe don't make that possible. And so that's the thing I want to encourage is let's be courteous to one another. Let's be kind. That doesn't mean we have to agree on everything. Right. And I want to hear, that, especially I want to hear, what we can do better. And we want to work towards that, but I want to be given the opportunity to do that, not just assuming that I'm corrupt or anybody's corrupt here, because that's certainly not the case. Every single member of the staff, all the members of the city council are all doing their best individually and collectively to serve this community. And so I really want that to be emphasized. I cannot emphasize that enough. So I will leave it with that. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the show. Thank you for joining me on this long-winded episode. I guess it's okay because it's been a while, right? In the future, I had talked about doing episodes such as on capital projects, economic development, endangered development updates. I'd also like to have conversations with other partner agencies and stakeholders. So talking to, our partners at the school district, and I'd love to have Callie Binks, the superintendent of Yucaipa Calimesa Joint Unified School District on the program. She is such a fascinating, intelligent, and just full of energy woman. And I think she'd be a great guest. I'd maybe talk to our water agencies, things like that. So we'll explore that more, but there's plenty of direction we can take on this podcast. And so we intend to do that. Keep in mind, we talked about city council meetings today. They take place on the first and third Monday of every month. Visit our website at cityofcalimesa.net to find links to all of our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram. They'll provide news, updates, and information. YouTube is is the exclusive home of our city council meetings now. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast catcher, whether it's Apple's podcasts. We're hosted by Spotify, so we may favor that a little bit. Just search for Calimesa Insider, or visit cityofcalimesa.net/podcast, and that'll take you right to our podcast page. So hopefully not as much time will pass between our next episode, and it'll be a little bit shorter. But until then, take care, and we'll see you next time.